Greetings and welcome back to another edition of MGTOW Talks. We are here with the now well-known and illustrious figure C.S. MGTOW to talk about the seeming distinct possibility of a universal or basic income in light of current and recent economic circumstances, which is to say, not just something temporary, but a semi-permanent paradigm shift in the way economies and governments operate. To offer this hypothesis and insight, I am going to turn the stage over to CS to explain why he thinks that's the case and what that might look like. So, please.
Hello, Stardust. It's a real pleasure to be with you again. I guess the first thing is that what we're seeing across Europe, at least at the moment, and to maybe perhaps a smaller extent the US, is a kind of chilling echo of the rise of the far right, like you know was experienced in the 1930s, and the growth in support for the far right and anti-foreignist parties have been fed really by the worst recession since at least the 1930s. So we're seeing mass unemployment, falling living standards made worse, of course, by austerity measures across Europe, and parties that have traditionally remained in the shadows are now really re-emerging and playing on the sympathies and providing, I guess, at least on the surface, a legitimate alternative to the more kind of mainstream parties, particularly when they have a PR facelift. And the current global recession is, of course, the most serious global recession for about 100 years. And in many ways, it's far more serious than the 1930s. So young men in particular in this current recession feel particularly powerless. And the economic, I guess, to the extent that we have these kind of brief periods of economic recovery, men are being left behind. So when we look at the rise of far-right groups, like, for example, in Greece, we have the Golden Dawn Party, which is, for all intents and purposes, a neo-Nazi outfit. I mean, even when you, for example, look at the clothing that some of the more kind of militant members of these groups wear.
Symbolism, the flags,
Absolutely. We have the British National Party in the UK. We have the National Front Party led by Le Pen in France. And so again, it's the rise of an extreme, rightist or far leftist, depending on which part of the policies you look at.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think, look, whenever there's an economic problem, when there's a shortage and a dearth of job opportunities, people just look to blame people. I mean, the I suspect that a lot of the hostility that was projected in light of Brexit into the say the Polish workers in the United Kingdom, if the economy were perfectly dandy and there were no problems, no one would have batted an eyelash at the Poles.
Exactly.
Instead, there was a lot of vitriol. I think even one Polish guy was assaulted, and some shops were destroyed or at least vandalized. So this is just human nature, basically. But one thing I think people tend to forget is that the GFC, the global financial crisis, which I suppose had its height, between 2008 2009, that is still ongoing. People think, I mean, quote unquote experts have claimed that we've largely recovered, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at the way economies have transformed, particularly in Germany, there's this whole concept of the mini job. Now, a mini job, it's not a part-time job where you're working, 15, 20 hours a week. We're talking literally 4 hours a week, 3 hours a week. And many people, skilled and unskilled, particularly in their 20s, are doing these jobs and partitioning their time up where they're just doing, they're literally doing 6 or 7 mini jobs in order to get enough income together to get by. When I think I had my Dutch friend Brecht on, he's been struggling, very skilled guy, lots of practical skills and things like carpentry and plumbing and all sort of computing and building computers and all that sort of stuff. And there just aren't jobs around. And this seems to me, if you have certainly a practical skill set and you can't find a job, that there's something very diseased and ill in the economy.
Agreed. And I guess the main difference this time, so with a lot of these mini jobs, they're kind of sold to people as, you get to be your own boss, but, perhaps in, driving an Uber, taxi. And it's, you know, there's very, very little progression, of course. Often they're not particularly well paying, and these individuals can be cut with zero compensation,
Well, that's the other thing,
almost
yes,
at any
that I
time.
think is fascinating. Part of the new kind of status quo, economic status quo, is that there are no future prospects. So even if you were to get a job, like a 9 to 5, a 40 hour, 30 hour, 35 hour, whatever work week job, the chances that you're going to stay on there for extended period of time, or forever, as it were, back in the days, slim to none. I had a friend who ended up taking on a contract in Islamabad, Pakistan, because it paid well. Why does it pay well? Because no one wants to go there. They don't want to get blown up. But he was, because of the money. He couldn't get. He had been working for NGO for a while and just couldn't get a permanent contract or even a contract beyond a year. Couldn't even get a 5 year contract. And so things have just changed permanently. The job market is just vastly different from what it used to be. I mean, yeah, you can find jobs where you can survive off like these mini jobs, but there are no future prospects there. And the idea of spending 10 or 15 years doing 5 different jobs a week just to make ends meet, I suspect is not very appealing to people.
Agreed. And that's why I believe, as do a lot of economists, that this time round that there will be no recovery. In the last recession, consumers were not in debt to the tune of 12 trillion just in the USA alone. The United States government wasn't in debt, or to the tune of 17 and a half trillion. Students weren't in debt with loans to the tune of 1.2 trillion. We didn't have this level of consumer, governmental, or student debt in even, for example, the crisis of 2006. So this time round, it's very, very unlikely that there will be any kind of sustained recovery. What we may see are very, very brief periods, 6 months or so, of some kind of a, green shoots type, where one sector in particular adds maybe 40 to 50,000 new jobs, and that's it. Then we go back to the new norm. Also, what is particularly destructive about the recession this time round, starting from 2006, is that the recession has hit men the hardest, especially young men. And what has happened, of course, men lost far more jobs than women did in the Great Recession, over 6 million jobs, or 8.5% of the total employed, compared to women who lost about 2.7 million jobs, or 3.5% of the female labor force. This time round, full-time employment for men aged 20 to 24 fell 10% just from 2008, and it's getting far worse. And these jobs are not coming back. That is the big difference with past recessions versus this recession. And then let's just kind of look back at the Industrial Revolution for a second. People mostly worked in agriculture. Then after agriculture became mechanized, more people worked in manufacturing. As manufacturing became automated, jobs moved to the tertiary sector, so we all became marketing executives and sales executives. And this is an inevitable consequence of progress. And what we're seeing now, as the tertiary sector is becoming mechanized, for the average person, there literally is nowhere to go. And a good example of this would be investment banking. Um, the industry itself has shed tens of thousands of jobs. And the reason why I bring up investment banking is that a lot of people assume that, if you happen to have lucked out, let's say into a high IQ, kind of circumstance, and you maybe get a job as an investment banker, then you're okay. It's just the people, who aren't, maybe wearing.
Bricklayers, as it were.
Absolutely, but it's affecting everybody. So, the investment banking business has shed tens of thousands of jobs since the financial crisis, because the financial crisis coincided with a shift to automation, and this slashed, staffing needs, and spawned a new, much smaller generation of quantitative traders whose decisions are largely mathematical models. Another example would be in 1964, the world's most valuable company was AT&T, and it was worth about 267 billion in today's dollars. It employed about 750,000 people. Today's, Google, which is, the largest company in the world, is worth 370 billion dollars. So it's a larger company than AT&T was, and manages to achieve such wealth with 55,000 employees. That's less than a tenth of AT&T's workforce in its heyday. So we're seeing, of course, a lot of these jobs are going and simply not coming back. Since 2000, the number of manufacturing jobs has fallen almost by 5 million, or 30%. This is,
Hmm.
male, a very, very male dominated industry. Another example would be that, for example, in 2016, the most successful Apple and Samsung, supplier Foxconn, slashed 60,000 factory workers and simply replaced them with robots. So they brought the number of employees needed to run their factory from 110,000 down to
Well,
50,000.
yeah, and you look at, I mean, you mentioned Google and YouTube in particular. Many YouTube content providers, creators have complained about the automated nature. I mean, there's no one to appeal to unless you're a huge, huge channel
Yeah.
that that has resources like these new rules being implemented on YouTube about cyberbullying, and tons of channels have been just disintegrated. Leafy is here, this guy who does it's a sort of a professional I'll pick on you channel. He's got over 4 million subs, so he's safe. So, but it's just not cost efficient to have individuals uh, fielding queries and problems on for individual YouTube content producers. Uh, I definitely see this trend. Well, someone himself as a YouTube content producer. This is definitely the way it's going to be, and it's probably going to get worse and worse. It's not like they're going to be more attentive in the future. They're going to try to streamline ever more, and if people fall by the wayside, well, they're not really going to care. Now,
Exactly. Well, if it works for Google and or YouTube, and it makes them very, very profitable, companies in the same space who have similar business models, if not in, content delivery, but in other areas, will simply follow suit. Just simply because you once you program a computer, it doesn't need ongoing training. It doesn't take paternity leave. It doesn't take maternity leave. It never calls in sick. It simply keeps on working. And I guess, I had a discussion with Adam Jensen yesterday, who's a libertarian, and a number of myths prevail in libertarian
still need to
econ.
check that out, so you'll have to fill me in.
Sure thing. In libertarian kind of economic circles, and even the kind of classical neoliberal schools, a number of myths really prevail about labor. And, the first would be that labor is flexible, that skills are transferable, and labor is mobile. And the rationale is then used to support that, hey, if there's a change in the demand for labor, the supply will simply adjust accordingly. On some level, of course, this is true. For example, if you don't have young children, or children at all, you can move country to take a better paying job. For example, your friend who you mentioned is now going to Islamabad. If you have lots of money, you
Yeah,
can take.
he's childless and not married, so
Absolutely. And if, for example, you happen to have sufficient disposable income, you can take on additional qualifications if your industry downsizes. The problem is that the vast majority of people don't fit into any of these brackets. That's essentially, being mobile, possessing transferable in-demand skills, or having the spare time and money to retrain. So automation really, really hits these individuals hard. So, for example, if you happen to live at home or own your own home, have a family in a set area, have children, have a relationship, or simply not have 20 to 30,000 put aside to take on a university degree or an additional university degree when your current industry downsizes. And it's estimated that about 50% of occupations will be redundant in just 11 years' time due to automation.
hmm. So essentially, what we're seeing here is sort of setting up fertile ground, as it were, for what some people might have thought an impossibility, a universal income, not even, basically welfare based on need or traditional welfare, but people just getting government checks because they exist. Now, I think we do see some foreshadowing of that. There are a number of the Danish guy was, I mean, he's essentially permanently on welfare. There are a lot of people who just decide to go down that path. My Dutch friend, he's been criticized by people he knows for not just, taking benefits and welfare checks because effectively they're making just as much and not doing any work. So I guess there's some foreshadowing of that, although in terms of scale, what you're predicting would just be vastly different. Maybe you can go with some of those details.
Absolutely. So you are completely right, but the fallout for these job losses, or simply the jobs that are never created as a result of this process of progress, are the men who otherwise might have held these jobs now will, of course, be far more open to ideas which resemble radical militant fascism. So, for example, we look at the factors of production, that there are four factors of production recognized by economists. We have land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. The average individual out there can only contribute labor. Obviously, we're not all entrepreneurs. It's a very, very specific mind state. Most people don't own land, and most people certainly don't have the capital at a very basic level to contribute towards production in that way. So in the past that was fine. They contributed labor to the IT revolution, the industrial revolution. So this was completely fine. So as a result of their contribution of labor to the process, they could actually get paid. Now people have automation, or now industries are automating. Their labor is simply not needed. They cannot make a meaningful contribution to the productive capacity of a nation, so they can't get paid. And one of the kind of few real solutions, quote unquote, that the political class have to avert what is going to be a perfect storm is the universal basic income. And the idea is to give every citizen enough money to cover their basic needs, like food and shelter, no strings attached, and to guarantee these basic needs to ensure that no one would live in poverty. And let's say perhaps that may be at a cost of $1,000 per month per adult, and maybe $300 per month per child. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that every dollar spent keeping a child out of poverty saves about $3 to $9 as an adult, simply because of the welfare transfer model that we have. So on some level, it actually does make sense, even without looking into the cost of the thing, which we're going to be doing a little bit later on. So, and I think maybe something which I find particularly interesting is that although a lot of individuals may be quite aghast, of the idea of a basic universal income, unbeknown to members of the public, a lot of countries are currently piloting it. So that they've either just recently completed pilots within the last couple of years, or as we speak, are currently piloting it. So a couple of examples. Firstly, Finland right now is planning to give every single citizen 800 euros a month in scrap benefits, and the cost of the government is going to be about 52 billion euros a month. Universal basic income is being trialed in Oakland, in California. 100 families there are going to be given between $1,000 to $2,000 each every single month to test how a basic income affects their lives. And that's the first experiment in the States. The Canadian province of Ontario is planning to trial a universal basic income, providing each citizen 3,700 pounds sterling every single month, as long as you qualify and you're between the ages of 25 to 65.
That's an enormous amount of sterling. Is that converted from Canadian dollars? Because that's an enormous amount of money to
Oh
give.
yes, that's essentially an upper middle class salary after tax. That's
Yeah, yeah.
that's a huge amount of money. In 2017, Utrecht in the Netherlands is trialing the universal basic income with 250 residents. And these individuals have been selected at random. They're going to participate in a government program to receive 960 euros a month, plus an additional 150 euros a month if they put, if they provide volunteer services like, painting of buildings, maintenance of schoolyards. In the UK, the Labour Party is now considering backing the universal basic income as its official party policy. We see India that tried a universal basic income in 2012, 2013. The program was funded by the UN, and what they basically did was that they picked 8 villages at random and they gave them a basic income for 18 months. And contrary to what was, I guess, predicted, it had a positive growth effect. It resulted in far more economic activity and work. And so we see consistently that governments around the world in countries both poor and wealthy are testing out the universal basic income.
Uh, uh,
Uh,
if I might interject, I think in my observation, comparing, and I don't think necessarily saying claiming that you're comparing them, but comparing, say, India, third world to pretty much still third world, to Western Europe, first world. Obviously, if I recall right, you just mentioned their economic growth increased. Um, but if you're starting from the bottom, of course, right, it's it's easier to increase your economic productivity. I think the reasoning there might be slightly different. And as in the West, well, to avert political disaster and the rise of fascism, I don't know. I guess my question is, do you think people, let's say, 10 years time, every Western European country that can afford it is going to send €1,000 checks to every citizen? Now, you can kind of live off of that more or less, sort of. Do you think people will even bother working in light of that?
That's a great question. And that was one of the initial concerns I had. Can we transplant a randomized study conducted in India? And the UN did conduct it as a randomized study, and transplant that to an advanced, Western nation. It would seem the answer is yes. So between 1974 and 1979, economists in Canada selected residents in Manitoba, just a couple of towns there, and sent them monthly checks with no strings attached for an experiment. And the Canadian government's interest in the program faded, but it was funded by the Canadian government. And what they found was that in these towns, despite these individuals getting free money essentially, the number of hours worked only dropped by 10%. And that was mainly because essentially that they then just had more stay-at-home mums who just thought, well, okay, this is great. Now I can stay at home with my children. But the very positive effect was that children who otherwise would have been pressurized to leave the labor force to go and find a job early. So, once the kids finish high school, okay, look, we don't have any money to support you, so you need to go and get a job maybe at the age of 16 or 15, could now finish high school and then continue in further education. So it's not a, obviously we cannot take the situation in India as a direct comparison, but we do have a lot of experience of this from a first world country. And then people should keep in mind. So they got this check for about 5 years. So that's it's a very significant level of time, and we didn't see an abandonment of the desire to work. And we'll be getting into that a little bit later on, because what tends to happen is that people don't just suddenly quit work. Quite the contrary. And I think it's important that we're guided by the data there.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, obviously, if people still want to afford things that would be considered luxury items or beyond the scope of what, say, €1,000 a month can get you, you're going to have to work additional hours. And I can even see in this context how a mini job might be helpful. Let's say you get a universal income and you're also running 4 to 5 mini jobs, then you can all of a sudden afford even more than you thought possible, but your basic sort of survival isn't necessarily threatened. You're not doing the mini jobs because you're desperate to survive so much as just to get supplemental income.
Exactly. I think one of the things which is important for us to consider is a little discussed fact. So when a lot of people, for example, look at the idea of basic universal income, they'll say, well, society will fall apart because most people won't work. But let's just kind of look at that for a second. At the moment, the bottom 95% of the society pay about 40% of income taxes. So, the top 5% of earners pay a disproportionate amount in the US, about 60% of all federal income taxes.
Mm.
That's absolutely huge. So even if we had a scenario where 90% of the people out there got this universal income and they basically spent their time smoking weed, shooting up heroin, masturbating, and playing video games, if the 10% of people still went out there, created new products, services, and wealth, that would still be a net positive to society, just based on the current model we have, which is the top 5% of earners, according to all of the studies that we have by, Andrew Lundin and co. The top 5% of earners pay 60% of all federal income taxes. So even if we did have a worst case scenario where people just masturbated in between playing video games, society may not necessarily be worse off.
Mm. Well, presumably those people, well, as you point out, they didn't really contribute that much tax revenue to begin with.
To
So
begin with, anyway, absolutely.
yeah, so that isn't necessarily a huge loss. But I mean, inflation is a reality that we live with. I'm, s- I'm curious how, I guess, if this were implemented on a mass scale, there would have to be, government agencies and agents to trying to figure out how we adjust the universal income with the perpetual inflation we experience, as well as have to work in close sync with central banks.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Just before kind of getting into that, I think maybe, the kind of paradox is that, people are, I mean, there's lots of evidence to suggest that people are miserable doing nothing. So, at least most individuals want to do something productive, that they want to get out of the house and engage economically with the society, and, and also just be able to afford luxuries.
Yeah.
So I don't see a scenario where the vast majority of people quit working. But you are completely right. The affordability is going to be a huge issue. How much do these people get? We're obviously going to notice a ratcheting effect over time. And what I think is important to realize is that the existing system creates what we might call a benefits trap. That is that we have kind of a tapering effect, or so the marginal rate of tax is absolutely astronomical on low income. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm earning on welfare currently, 500 euros a month.
Mhm.
To go out and get a job, and obviously that's after tax, to go out and get a job paying me, because obviously maybe I have a low skill set or I don't have an in-demand skill set. If I go out and get a job earning 600 euros, the effective marginal tax rate is absolutely astronomical because on that 600 euros, maybe I'm paying,
Oh yeah,
200
you're
euros.
going to be effectively getting the same as your welfare. That's the problem. Say in places like Germany and the Netherlands, it's more economical to just go on benefits in a lot of cases than to actually work a quote unquote proper job. 30 hours, 40 hours, whatever.
Absolutely. And the universal basic income removes this tax rate on low incomes
Mm,
just by its existence. So that is the first, I guess, net positive there. But of course, the affordability is going to be key. And how does the machinery of government move to make this happen? So when, for example, we look at the Congressional Budget Office, according to their estimates in the USA, the federal government spends about 220 billion on income security programs. When you take into account tax, credits, which cost, 73 billion, child tax credits, another 56. So we're at already 349 billion. When we look at, for example, other expenditures that could be, eliminated to pay for a universal basic income, 180 billion for the exclusion of employer contributions to healthcare, 100 billion for deduction of, for state and non-local business taxes. So again, we come up with all of these, things that could be removed from the budget. And very, very quickly, we're about 895 billion, of savings that could be made. Now, to give the average individual, so every single citizen, about $3,000 per person per year would cost about 1.9 trillion. Then when we compare that with the fact that the US GDP is about 16.7 trillion, this isn't a huge amount of the GDP. That's only about 9% of GDP. So very, very quickly, just by eliminating a lot of existing government programs, you would have most of the money to pay people, possibly let's say $1,000, or so per month, for adults, and maybe a couple of $100 per month per child as a universal basic income.
Do you
And
see do you see a possible, I mean, based on what you're the picture you're painting now, I envision a lot of the wealthy taxpayers, the ones who are paying the majority of taxes, essentially engage in economic flight. I mean, they'll say, well, why should I stay in this country X, whichever it might be, pay incredible taxes to pay for people to exist?
th
Uh,
that's a great question, and I think we ought to look at it in the wider scheme of things. The first thing is this: if individuals no longer have to worry about, where's their meal coming from at the age of 15, I guess on paper the hypothesis is that people will be far more likely to stay in education. So as an entrepreneur, I get to benefit from a far better educated local population. Also, I guess the second thing is that based on the numbers we have when we look at a universal basic income, and again, I'm neither a proponent or an opponent of this. I just think it's the direction that society is going to take. It can possibly be achieved without increasing taxes. So the average individual who's already paying maybe a 20% tax wouldn't necessarily see an increase in taxes. And what may actually happen is that the net proceeds by the government may actually increase simply because we don't have the incredible cost associated with moving from benefits to a low-paid job, and that actually keeps individuals on benefits. So a lot of individuals stay on benefits because it simply is disadvantageous because of the tax rate to go to a low-paid job from, let's say, 500 euros worth of benefits every
I mean,
single.
taxes, I know firsthand, are just incredibly punitive, particularly in Europe on low income earners. Far
Absolutely.
more so in terms of just living standards and costs than the wealthy. They do pay, the lion's share, but if you're making $1 million a year and you're taxed, 40% on that, or even 50%, you're still a lot better off than the guy who's making, I don't know, 24,000 euros a year and he's taxed 40% of that, so
Absolutely, it's a huge difference, and that's magnified further when a guy is earning 1,000 euros a month
yeah.
and loses 270 euros of that to various taxes and government mandated insurance. It's the difference between being able to eat nutritious food versus having to eat tinned food 4 nights a week. It's a tremendous difference. So what we find again with the current model is that individuals who don't particularly have high skills that are in high demand are essentially forced to stay on welfare.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, we talked about the political aspect of this. It's interesting because this could be the only way to avert potentially a political calamity that's coming. Um, as you mentioned, I mean, historically, there's precedent. Every time there are serious economic problems, people, get their pitchforks and blame whoever might be convenient at any given moment. I do have one concern, though. Well, it's obviously you're just describing rather than advocating, but we saw last year during the height of the so-called immigration crisis, the influx of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions in total now, of low-skilled, low IQ, religious Muslims into Europe, essentially to get welfare checks half the time. Would
Absolutely.
not a universal income be another yet another case of just sort of dangling the fruit and say, yeah, guys, come over here, we have it good. And I mean, the only way, to my mind, that that could work out is to have a much stricter immigration policy.
For sure, I agree with this. So universal basic income is suicide without closed borders. But, well, not necessarily closed borders, but
But well-regulated borders, means testing, as far as
absolutely,
immigration is concerned.
absolutely. And also, countries would have to jealously guard who gets citizenship. So certainly it would be suicidal if, as for example in the UK, citizenship is handed out like candy in addition to, but again, that also applies to even just regular welfare. So without having means testing and a strong border, regular welfare is simply
Well, that's Clive.
ludicrous.
That's what we've seen in the past year or so. That the welfare system can't work if people aren't paying into it, and when it's overburdened. I mean, this was the problem. This is
Agree.
why it works to a degree, but once you have too many people coming in who are culturally distinct, genetically distinct, well, by that I mean that they're not particularly bright, and they bring the lovely religion of peace with them, that can't work. And I think it would be even worse, if you had a universal income,
Agree.
which would just be like a beacon, like light to moths, just drawing these people in. Because in some way, I don't blame them. A lot of these people coming from these countries, the countries are in horrific condition. They're unpleasant, and I mean, you kind of see this though. This is what's been going on. I was in talks with Coltane privately. Is that a lot of these people, they want the benefits and the luxury of the West by at the same time maintaining their own religious, cultural ideology or inheritance.
Agree.
But the universal income, since it's obvious it couldn't work without without strict border control. I mean, how, given the trajectory of things, I mean, I don't see any mainstream politician coming out. And by mainstream, I don't mean Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage. He's not a politician anymore, but someone saying like, well, Merkel going back on her word and say, well, we're going to shore up the borders now. Everyone, I don't know, but I do see one thing positive. I think, as well as it'll be released in a little bit, my talk on aging and how with Adam Jensen, how a lot of aging research is funded by cosmetic industries, like aka by women, effectively.
Yeah.
That a universal income, I think, would appeal very much to women because women, I think, much more so than men. Men are we generally want to do something constructive, whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
Women, I would argue, tend to be much more content just popping out kids and I don't know, gossiping. I think they would certainly find the universal income a very appealing thing.
Yeah.
And despite a lot of evidence that Coltane has proposed, not maybe not actual voting, but women do have a sort of political momentum. And when they say, "Oh, universal income, that's great," I think that could be a way of getting it through. And at the same time, if you presented the argument to women that, well, we need to maintain the borders because it might not be affordable, and then you won't benefit from the universal income. I'm just trying to think of a way this could work because you're going to have to take women into account there in this case.
Great. Well, for all intents and purposes, women have always had a universal basic income, which
Yeah,
is the marriage contract.
yeah.
So for them, it just fits neatly with what they've always known. A very interesting fact reported in the Telegraph in 2016, in April, is that half of the individuals in Britain, that is 50% of the country upwards, pay zero income tax. So, so, so,
Interesting.
so the vast majority of people simply currently do not make an economic contribution anyway. So a lot of the ideas that that all of a sudden people will stop making an economic contribution, well, they currently don't.
Mm.
So I think that is a very, very real thing. And certainly, what we're likely to notice is that, of course, some people won't. But again, the fact that the top 5% already pay the vast majority of taxes shows that for all intents and purposes, we're already there, and this may simply help us avert disaster. One area that I am incredibly concerned about is that if a universal basic income is adopted by a country, the levels of violence we're likely to see. So, when, for example, we take parts of the community, let's say in the United States or Britain, actually in most first world countries, where we've seen the mass adoption of welfare in those communities, one of the things we've noticed, and Barbarossa was, pointed this out many years ago, that male versus male competition turns violent. So instead of men, let's say, competing for the affections of women by the quality of job they hold, how much they're able to earn, because welfare essentially levels the earning capacity of men and women, males resort to other means to essentially peacock, and that is who's the most violent. So that's where game arose. So that was a method by which men used to differentiate themselves. Now, if we have a universal basic income where the average man and women are earning the same thing, hypergamy still demands to be satisfied.
Mm.
And the way that's likely to be satisfied is just tremendous levels of game and particularly inner city male versus male violence for sexual access. So that is an extreme negative I see from it. So I do, foresee that if this is adopted, we're simply likely to see just a burgeoning, prison population as men turn violence and sadistic as a means of differentiating themselves. Now that the economic means to differentiate themselves, goes off the table.
At the same time, women will be, I mean, the whole 20/80 rule might become a 10/90 rule. I mean, they'll be looking at the absolute apex, the people who don't even need a universal income. Uh, I think it would actually be pretty disastrous to the reproductive market, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things would change. As an individual, I, not being part of the reproductive market, that doesn't really interest me or it doesn't affect me. But the fallout, gangs of hoodlums and men, bashing each other over the head with baseball bats. That's not something I would look forward to.
Absolutely. So we're certainly going to have far more visible tattoos, just knee-jerk casual violence. We're certainly absolutely going to have a lot of inner city. Well, actually, we may not even see inner city ghettos. We may see, I guess, suburban ghettos, because the inner city areas, if everybody's earning a kind of basic income, will likely be unaffordable to most individuals. So everybody just kind of scatters to the countryside, and you're likely to see just these kind of green belts of any country just have tremendous amounts of violence, absolutely tremendous, as experienced by the inner city African American community in the US when welfare was introduced. And I think this is a very serious consequence. And the end result of that will be necessarily far more hands-on, very aggressive policing to deal with this new menace. So certainly violence will likely increase across many layers of society as a result of a universal basic income. So despite everything that I've been saying so far, I think this is necessary to avert one form of fallout, but it's certainly going to create its own type of problems.
Well, as they say, every action has an equal and lots of reaction. I mean, you can't basically restructure the entire basis of what has been an economic paradigm for decades and even longer, maybe a century plus, and then expect nothing different to come of it. But increasingly, even if that's the case, so this is interesting because on the one hand, people might think, well, universal income, it'll avert the rise of fascism, for example. But it'll create new types of violence potentially. I mean, the alt-right is very much a reproductive movement in as much as they're always talking about, having white children and white wives and white this and white that. The I mean, this is just going to get a lot worse. All of the sort of racial tension potentially could get a lot worse because of competition. I mean, Coltane's most recent video where the guy was complaining about BBC. Um, I don't know. I foresee, despite the benefits it might have in some regards, it could be disastrous in others. Of course, I have no control over this, and if it happens, it'll happen. But
Of course.
I think we see even more, as you pointed out, even more heightened racial tension and reproductive, essentially reproductive tension in the expressed as racial tension. Yeah.
Agreed, absolutely. And I think that statement really summarizes what, at least what I see the alt-right is about. It's reproductive tension, expressing as racial tension. So for example, let's say if a universal basic income is, let's say, adopted in the USA, if you get onto Rush's website, Return of Kings, his idea of game might change from, how to neg a woman to how to put another man in a martial arts chokehold, or
Yeah.
three
Although
most important life.
Roosh is not accepted by the alt-right, as we
Oh
know,
yes, for
because
sure.
he's not white. So
But you kind of see very
yeah,
much.
yeah, no. Oh yeah, well, Roosh himself is an opportunist. He'll
Absolutely,
say whatever is necessary to get his product across.
absolutely,
Be it Brazilian jiu-jitsu or how to chat up a girl and get her in bed in an hour or whatever. I mean, it's same
absolutely. So
thing.
so expect at least most game to then be cornered around different martial arts and how to fend off three guys in a dark alley when you've managed to persuade that girl to go home with you. That's what I assume game will then quickly become about, increasing dealing with the increasingly violent society that one experiences.
Yeah, man, I hope we can postpone the universal income a while yet, just because I don't want to have to deal with day-to-day violence. I mean, having grown up in an area that wasn't exactly the safest, I don't really fancy returning back to that era myself.
Agreed.
So, yeah, not my desire. But if this is the trajectory, then this is the trajectory. I
Agreed.
think.
Well,
Sorry.
oh no, please go ahead.
No, I'm done. I'm done.
And I certainly think it is the trajectory. So for example, we're now seeing the introduction of self-driving trucks and cars. Uh,
Oh, yes, yes. I wanted to mention that exactly. So I read an art. I can't find it, but I remember reading an article a while back. It might have been over a year about taxi services being replaced. I mean, think of it this way: you're a taxi driver. Part of your livelihood is knowing the area, the city you work in. You need to know the ins and outs. That requires a lot of time on the job, familiarity, etc. Well, if you have a computer programmed car with Google Maps that can do everything in an automated fashion, knows the tricks of the trade far better without any, training, you can see the taxi services being completely replaced by much more efficient computer automated driven cars.
exactly. And also what we notice at the moment, for example, with the trucking industry is it's a human driver, of course, can only drive for so many hours a day. So the company who employs them is losing out essentially on about 16 hours a day of labor, whether essentially this tremendously expensive piece of capital that is the truck is idle, or they have to get another driver
Mm.
in that time with a a self-driving truck. You have a tremendous productivity increase and revenue increase for the company owning the truck. And you then have about 3.5 million truck drivers in the US out of work overnight, and about 2.5 million taxi drivers out of work. So again, these jobs are not going to go to other parts of the economy wholesale. Maybe now there are 60,000 more mechanics who specialize in self-driving trucks, or existing mechanics retrain in self-driving trucks, but you certainly don't get the 3.5 million jobs destroyed, among the truck drivers created elsewhere. That anybody who says that, I think, is engaging in fantasy. 3.5 million people who are now functionally permanently unemployed is not a good thing for any society.
No,
That is
I mean,
particularly men.
yeah, they're gonna grab the baseball bats, the machetes, the guns, and uh, this has been, yeah, I mean, yeah, unemployed men, particularly young men, tend to present problems in
Absolutely.
terms of violence and yeah, but this is where everything's going. Automation, taxi drivers will be gone, truck drivers will be gone. Um, it's well, I don't work in it anymore, but in the industry I used to work in translation, I mean, one of the great goals, essentially, and this is has been a continuous concern, and I guess it will be until it happens, is that human translators be replaced by automated translators. Now, at this current stage, even now in 2016, computer translations generally just aren't. They, they lack without going into details, the sophistication to deliver the same product as a human translator. But there's some debate, theoretical debate. If and when that happens, then you're going to have another entire industry out of work because, why pay somebody per word for hours of work when you can just press a button and get everything done in an instant?
Exactly, exactly.
Everything's, yeah,
It's far quicker. So for the consumer, because we often have a trade-off between
yeah.
speed and quality, and a lot of consumers may simply value speed. That's why McDonald's exists, for example, in that trade-off between quality and speed. McDonald's, you can go in and get a hamburger in about
Even
five.
Google Translate, as far as
Absolutely,
is sufficient for a lot of people to get the gist of things. I mean, I'm talking more sort of professional venues like businesses and academic stuff. But I think even then, if the technology gets to that point, then people are just focused on efficiency. Why bother with people who this is a longer way off. I think this is probably another 2 decades until the translation industry sort of disintegrates. But why bother with all that if you can just click a button and wait a couple of minutes and you get all the results, better results potentially than with a human. I think automation is going to change the face of humanity and civilization as we know it, and not
absolutely.
just every facet you could imagine. And
Exactly. It also changes very, very significantly the type of businesses that can form. So, an example would be that fitting a vehicle with driverless capabilities costs about $30,000. When you compare that with the average, trucker's wage, which is about $40,000, the trucker is picking up that wage every single year, while the individual who owns the driverless, truck pays an initial upfront cost of maybe $30,000, and perhaps ongoing repairs to the driverless system of maybe $5,000 a year. So what you may have is a slightly higher upfront cost to enter a business, but then far more profits going forward. And this tremendously affects the economic system that we have. So again, that driver of the truck, up to maybe 20 years time, he gets to contribute labor to the market economy. Then he doesn't have anything to contribute to the market economy. And that is going to be not only a crushing blow to him as an individual, but also to the civilization. We know if we have 40 to 50 million persons permanently unemployed who are male, I don't think civilizations last very long after that.
no, no, and part of the problem, of course, is we're overpopulated. I mean, for all this talk of, oh well, we're not reproducing enough. I mean, given the direction of things, more people is bad because it means more mouths to feed. And yeah, I do see this happening though. It's just so many people I know just struggle, perpetually struggle to get by, even though
Yeah.
they have basic skills. And even if they have the skills, people don't want to give them, permanent employment. In case of my friend who had to wander off to Pakistan. Why are they paying him more? Well, because he's endangering his life effectively, and most people don't want to do that.
exactly.
taking ridiculous risks just to make a decent income. I don't think most people are going to want to do that all the time. I can't imagine he's going to want to stay in Islamabad for the rest of his life.
Exactly. And we're certainly heading towards mass unemployment at the hands of technology. I think what we're seeing now is that people are, going to get a college education or getting a master's or getting a PhD. And I pretty much see that as putting up sandbags, when we see that a tsunami is coming. It's fine if it's a small storm, a small storm, but when you essentially have 30-foot waves, people getting a master's education won't help. There simply won't be enough jobs for them to do. If you have, a PhD, but there aren't any openings, your PhD is useless from that point forward.
Oh yeah, that's why I ultimately decided not to go in my former field, linguistics. I mean, not only was I don't think that exceptional in it, but it was just I knew really, really smart people with it who were basically doing other stuff that they couldn't find jobs. Um, so yeah, I see advanced education, unless it's kind of relevant increasingly, is just sort of a waste of time. Uh, and never mind some of the other factors, but it is a market, and if there's no market for you, it happens to be the case that there's a market, say, for aging research, which is why Adam Jensen can do that stuff. But you know, other fields maybe less so. So
Absolutely.
PhD, basically, the conclusion of PhD is kind of meaningless unless it's an irrelevant field, or a master's degree for that matter. So
No,
it's
I agree, and we're seeing it, entire industries, and I think a lot of the I guess a lot of the assumptions put out in the past were that automation would only affect slightly low skilled or low paying but skilled jobs. So for example, if a guy's assembling cars, or if an individual is working on a production line somewhere, but actually we're seeing entire industries from medicine, commercial aviation to truck driving. Companies are racing ahead with automation very, very deliberately to reduce their dependency on human labor. If I have a factory and I have that factory mostly staffed by essentially robots, my I guess the kind of the marginal cost is then electricity. Can I pay the electricity to run this factory 24 hours? No longer do I have to shut the lights off when the workers leave at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I never have to be worried about strikes. So companies have a huge economic incentive to race forward with automation very deliberately to reduce the their reliance on human labor. So I don't think this is a bad thing, and I'm certainly not a communist, not at all. But I think it's certainly going to
well,
impact
look,
society.
things things happen. They're transformative processes that occur throughout history. Um, the automobile was one of them. The computer was a huge one. Birth control. Things happen, and if automation is the way of the future, because that's just what businesses universally are going to shift to, then people need to think about the consequences of that. And yeah, millions of unemployed young men. Uh, well, most of them are probably not going to just sort of chill out and be peaceful. I think there are going to be issues. So a consequence of that, whether people like it or not, is maybe there does need to be universal income at the very least to hold back the worst of the possible violence that could arise from that. Um,
Exactly.
it's just something you have to think about. You can't just put if let's say it's inevitability. Let's say in 20 to 30 years, 70 to 80% of industries are redundant. You don't have people checking in anymore because there just aren't people there. Everything's just done on a computer. Uh, I mean, people are if you don't have a universal income, they'll have no means to eat. I mean, there's gonna be violence. There's gonna be theft. There's gonna be criminality. I just don't. You have to take that into account. And here's where I think ideology tends to get people worked up. We're not even talking about ideologies here. We're just talking about the reality of changing circumstances and fact of the matter is transformative processes that affect society. Is if this is the next big thing, then it doesn't matter whether it jives with your ideology or not. There probably will have to be some kind of universal income to stave off the worst of the fallout.
Exactly. An example was reported by the New York Times in 2016 that the average operator, the average airline pilot operating a Boeing 777, in a typical flight spent just 7 minutes manually piloting their planes.
Mm.
And in the newest Airbus planes, it was about half that time. So 3.5 minutes in, let's say, maybe the average flight is 3 hours or so, actually piloting the plane. So we could very, very soon envisage a future where you don't need for a long haul flight a crew of three pilots. You need possibly, essentially just a senior pilot for that 3.5 minutes of, manual piloting.
And
So
possibly completely automated piloting at some point in time.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, we actually already are seeing, completely automated piloting. For example, the war in the Middle East is now being run to a large degree by autonomous drones
Mm.
with just an individual in some kind of virtual cockpit many, many
Hanging
miles
out in
away.
the desert in Arizona, yeah,
Exactly, sipping a Starbucks coffee and every once in a while punching in commands.
to 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 kill the people there. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really just crazy. I don't think anyone could have thought of this 30 years ago, but this is pretty much where we're at. And you know, you know,
And it may even be safer. So, I mean, when, for example, we consider that the overwhelming majority of accidents on roads are caused by driver error.
mm,
So, I guess a lot of the arguments that drive this might even, not even just be limited to the profit motive, but statistically, if it's safer for us to have driverless cars, I think then we have possibly the moral discussion. Should we allow humans to still pilot cars if a driverless car costs the same and they're safer? And I think that is another question that society will have to deal with. But of course, the end result of this is unemployment for people who otherwise would be, driving trucks or taxis or conducting repairs on these old system cars.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, it's, I think in some ways, I feel privileged to have grown up in an era where there was still a lot of that older stuff, and now this tremendous transition. I was listening to a conversation with Sam Harris and Dave Rubin, recent talk on the Rubin Report, and the, I mean, Dave Rubin was talking about his niece and nephew or two or something, playing with iPhones. It's just, it's transformed everything, and now, those children who are born now are by the time they come of age, maybe universal income that will be like they won't know anything different.
Absolutely,
Uh,
absolutely.
it's pretty incredible. But one of my only, well, I have a lot of concerns, but my major concern is that there needs to be a new immigration policy if they're going to implement that. You can't have the entire world come to get their universal checks.
Agreed, agreed. No country is wealthy enough for that, and it's simply unfair to the 5% who are actually paying the majority of taxes. If they're for all intents and purposes subsidizing half the world, that is a level. I mean, not only is it unfair, it's just simply economically impossible.
Yeah,
The number, so it would have to be combined with, actually, ironically, with a lot of the demands of the alt-right at the moment, which include much stricter immigration policies.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, of course, the outright is purely ideologically motivated by this. I mean,
Agreed, agreed.
and it will be interesting going forward to see how a lot of that will, I guess, what the interaction will be between some of these parties. I'm looking at France now and thinking about all the stuff that's happened, and I'm beginning to think that Le Pen is a shoe-in possibly.
Yes, it is very, very possible. It is very, very possible. And again, I mean, I think it's going to cause a lot of upheaval in France if she's elected.
Hmm.
I don't see how that works out positively for the country.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, who knows? But I mean, there's so many attacks now in Europe that it's hard to keep track. I mean, no one really reported it, but there's in North Rhine-Westphalia, there was a town, Troisdorf, where a guy attempted to chop off a doctor's head
Yeah,
because of reasons. The guy turned out to be Palestinian. Uh, and now the newspapers in Germany are going on about all this stuff happening. What is Merkel going to do? And I don't know. I think in France in particular, I was communicating with someone who lives there the other night, and armed patrols everywhere, people being just stopped on the spot and questioned. Uh, it's becoming kind of a police state, and
exactly.
France is probably borne the worst. Well, it depends how you want to measure, but things just aren't even being reported. I mean, one thing that was kind of underreported was some guy that just walked up to a woman and her daughters and killed them or something because they
Oh
weren't
yes,
dressed
it's
appropriately.
stabbed them because they were wearing bikinis and
Yeah,
they
something
were on
like that.
holiday. And
Yeah, so I mean, before the universal income, the so-called far left, far right, I don't even know what to call them anymore, parties will, the far parties, I'll call them that, the far parties will probably get into power. And this just fuels them. There are going to be more attacks, particularly in France and Germany. So, there'll be more reason to vote for someone like Marine Le Pen, who still, she's not incredibly popular now, but people will just see that as a necessity.
exactly. Well,
And
do you remember her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was a
yeah,
hair's breadth away from the French presidency.
yes, yes.
I think it was what, four
And he didn't
elections.
even have the ongoing individual terrorist acts to boost him. So
Exactly. If, for example, Jean-Marie Le Pen were to have run, let's say they call a snap election today, he had the force of will in addition to the political climate or the social climate. I mean, I remember, I mean, he was, what, 5 points off Chirac, or,
yeah.
I mean, it was incredible. In fact, during that election, I was sure the guy was going to win because of all the polls at the time. And he was a hair's breadth away from the French presidency.
And I think that by now most people view Hollande as sort of weak and ineffectual. Uh, Even Sarkozy was very critical of him recently. Is just basically criticizing him for not doing a good job. He's going to be out. There's no way he's surviving. Socialist
Absolutely.
Party is going to go. What replaces it, I'm not exactly sure, but it certainly is looking favorable to Le Pen. And I think you probably won't see that in Germany because, yeah, once again, history is the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative for Germany is just, there's too much quote unquote history. In France, they're not as burdened by that. So I can see, I think, so a lot of this politics are going to take place before there is anything, I think, along the lines of a universal income, possibly at least. Yeah.
Agreed, agreed. And it's a very, very sad day, I guess, when somebody like Nicolas Sarkozy is able to hold anything
Yeah.
like the high ground, a tremendously flawed politician.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's not so much that he holds the high ground. It's just how should I put it? Hollande is being ineffectual, and I don't even really. It's not even really his fault. I mean, a lot of these things are just black swan events. I saw
Yes,
some guy come onto the comment section saying, "Well, your personal protection is your own business. You learn to self defense, learn firearms. Look, let's say you're at the Berlin train station because you need to catch a flight. I mean, at any given time, a black swan and half the station is incinerated and a mass chain of explosives. I mean, how do you prepare for something like that? You can't. Just as
exactly.
like you're walking down the street and all of a sudden, someone shouts "Allah snack bar," and all of a, and the shops start blowing up. I mean, you can't really prepare yourself. And so, in some sense, I'm not sympathetic, but I understand that Hollande can't really do a whole lot because he's what can he do? He's just he's a politician. He can't mind control people. He
Exactly.
can create a police state, I guess, but
Well, when you kind of look at it, and I think you're completely right that, about the nature of these Black Swan events, two things. Firstly, Hollande inherited a society which had allowed unfettered immigration for decades. And there were various reasons for that, including the colonies, France had, particularly in North Africa, and then just, insane social policies by governments, including Sarkozy's governments, later on. But for example, I mean, the average guy who thinks he's going to learn, martial arts and then carry a gun around, when, for example, we look at the Istanbul airport, attack,
yeah.
these guys were carrying around assault rifles. I mean, your 9mm is practically useless versus an
Mm.
assault rifle. I mean, what? I,
It's not even that. It's just that a gun isn't going to protect you from shrapnel or
exactly,
concrete caving in on your head. It's just
exactly.
this is the politicians can't really do very much unless they resort to drastic measures. And by that, I don't even mean, increase police patrols or questioning or interrogation. The fact of the matter is that um, realistically, what can they do when you just consider that these things can just randomly happen? Maybe they'll
Exactly.
blow up a store in Paris. I mean, just especially when they're lone wolves. These guys just doing their own thing, mentally ill in some cases, maybe just ideological in others. What
Exactly.
it, they're in a real bind. I mean, the only thing they could do is resort to draconian measures, like just you know banning Muslims or something. How they would even implement that, I have no idea.
Well, the fact that Europe hasn't already descended as a result of terrorism into a nightmare internal police state really, really speaks highly to the commitment towards, high ideals of freedom of movement, freedom of expression,
Hmm.
the right to voluntary association. And I think that's tremendously positive. And of course, what will likely happen over time as the attacks become more and more severe and frequent is that countries are going to start saying, look, we simply need to do away with these notions of the past because we've now entered a new world. So we need stop and search laws. We need to start racially profiling as almost a kind of self-defense mechanism. And again, in many ways, the alt-right will likely see the very, very same policies they gleefully want implemented,
Oh yeah,
rather
I've
ironically.
seen alt right channels. I mean I mean, it's kind of like a flip sided version of the distorted MGTOW dream of a societal collapse where getting revenge on everyone and so like yeah we need to we need more and more of these attacks until the point where finally people become racially aware and they start clamping down on this stuff. So and then the race war or the I don't know the religious war starts. I don't I wish I lived in New Zealand, but it's it's probably going to go somewhere along those lines. I mean, at some point in time, if these attacks literally become just weekly or even daily, then yeah, then the politicians will do something because they'll be forced to. But
Yeah.
I guess if there's enough sort of spread over time, if it's just once every 3 weeks and it's pretty minor, I suspect if we had more like Nice events, yeah, then on a consistent basis, then people would be pretty agitated and they would want people to do something. So,
Agreed. Agreed.
well, I think we've covered most of the bases. Really interesting hypothesis, and I mean, obviously there seems to be a fair amount of evidence to support the idea that this, in fact, will be implemented at some point in time. And likely before that, of course, we'll have to deal with a lot of political insanity. But seems to be the way of the world at the moment.
Unfortunately, it does, and it may be one of the few solutions the politicians have to avert essentially just a return to the 1930s, which harms civilization itself.
Yeah, we don't want a World War III,
Absolutely not.
given the weapons we have, given well, global terrorism. Um, the Islamists are running around. They're very unstable people. We need to do everything in our power as a civilization to avert something of a scale of World War III, because we could just incinerate this mud ball and then we'll have nothing left.
Exactly, exactly.
And I mean, an alternate to World War III, I guess, would just be sort of this everywhere. There's these sort of pocket civil wars, no nukes or anything, but just constant violence. Uh,
Well,
yeah,
the longer the violence goes on, the increase in the likelihood of nuclear weaponry.
yeah.
You
I mean, that's the worst case scenario. Like a nuclear weapon goes off in some Western city. Like you wake up and all of a sudden the news is everywhere because Seattle has been leveled and there's nothing left. And like what? And yeah, something like that. That would be pretty extreme.
Exactly.
But no, let's hope it doesn't go there.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the policies I would have implemented are just they're long past. You should have had stricter immigration. You shouldn't have had this open door policy, et cetera, et cetera. But it's kind of the ship has sailed, so we have to see.
Yeah.
Everyone, thanks for tuning in. I do need to check out CS's talk with Adam Jensen, the continuation of the previous talk. Sounds interesting. A lot of interesting material coming out. If you haven't checked out CS's video, where he runs a regression analysis on IQ and wealth, and as well as Coltane put out a really nice one, very very interesting one. Do check them out. They're the most recent videos, pretty much. A lot of interesting content coming out from you guys of late, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. I do have some things planned. As I said, the aging talk is already done. It will be uploaded tomorrow morning, which is to say GMT plus 1 morning. Better get your popcorn. It's very dense, but I think it's very interesting, and I think you might learn a lot. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. And so yes, it's always an honor and privilege to have you here.
It's been a real pleasure, Stardust. Thank you very much.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.